Washington Journal continues.
For the next hour, we're going to be talking about Pell Grants for kids in kindergarten through the 12th grade with Jeanne Allen of the Center for Education Reform and Mark Egan of the National School Boards Association. Before we get involved in the conversation, we want to take a look at a clip from President Bush's State of the Union address, where he announces his proposal to extend Pell Grants to high school students and children also in elementary school, saying that we must do more to help children in underperforming schools.
We must also do more to help children when their schools do not measure up. Thanks to the D.C. Opportunity Scholarships you approved, more than 2,600 of the poorest children in our nation's capital have found new hope at a faith-based or other non-public school. Sadly, these schools are disappearing at an alarming rate in many of America's inner cities. So I will convene a White House summit aimed at strengthening these lifelines of learning and to open the doors of these schools to more children. I ask you to support a new $300 million program called Pell Grants for Kids. We have seen how Pell Grants help low-income college students realize their full potential. Together, we've expanded the size and reach of these grants. Now let us apply the same spirit to help liberate poor children trapped in failing public schools.
Jeanne Allen of the Center for Education Reform, what did you think about the President's proposal?
Well, I think he continues to show people that he really wants the best opportunities for kids no matter what. I mean, he is the president. The federal government has very little to do with education, but he's consistently for 8 years, like so many others before him, shown that he wants to use his bully pulpit, and at least even his last year, to get children who are still consistently in failing schools the best opportunity possible. And providing some incentives for states to do that and scholarships is an outstanding idea and something embraced by most Americans.
Mark Egan?
Well, we give the president an A+ for consistency. He's offered a voucher proposal, a national voucher proposal, every year that he's been in office. The name has changed each and every year. This year it's Pell Grants for Kids. Last year it was Promise Scholarships. The year before that I think it was Opportunity Scholarships. Bottom line, the name change isn't going to change the result on Congress. There's widespread opposition to vouchers in Congress among Democrats, among Republicans, and despite the name change, I think the result's going to be the same. Congress is not going to enact this program.
If parents feel that their schools are underperforming and their kids are not getting the education that they would like to see them get, what's wrong with providing them with some measure of assisting them to get to a school that gives them the educational opportunities that they're looking for?
Well, you know, the reality is, as we've seen voucher programs around the country, and there are a handful around the country in different cities and states, and the results academically are not very encouraging. Students who have used vouchers to go to private schools, the best research out there shows that they have not done better than public school students by comparison. In our view, the National School Boards Association, the answer is we need to improve all public schools. Every child in this country deserves an excellent education. That's what parents want. That's what taxpayers want. It's in the best interest of the country that we educate all of our kids. And, you know, the numbers, there's a math equation here, simple math, that 90% of all students in this country go to public schools. If we want to improve education for all kids, we need to focus on strategies that are improving the education in the public schools, not the private schools.
Jeanne Allen, what about the argument that says, call it what you want, it's taking money out of the public school system that could be, or taking money out of the system that could be used to improve public schools?
Well, first, Rob, we have to talk about not the 90% of kids in public schools, but the 100% of kids out there that we have an obligation to serve and who are entitled to a great education no matter what. And there's not just one way to educate children. We know that, just like there's not one way to raise children. Those of us who have children know that there's not one way to teach every single child. And so because there's not a one-size-fits-all, I think that's one of the reasons the president does keep changing the name, because he's trying what he can do. Many of us in the school choice community do the same thing every day, to educate Americans about what it means, because it's so easy to just assume that the school down the street that looks nice, where your friends are teachers and maybe your cousins or school board members are doing the best they can, and they are, and it really is beyond doing the best you can. We have challenges every day in society that we must work harder to figure out. When there are people in the private sector as well as public sector that want to do it differently, we should let them start alternative public schools and charter schools. We should let them have the kind of Pell Grant scholarship opportunities that DC and Cleveland, Milwaukee give to children. And the reason we do that it's not about money, it's about education.
We're talking about Pell Grants, the President's proposal for Pell Grants for K through 12 with Jeanne Allen and Mark Egan. If you'd like to get involved in the conversation, the number is 202-737-0001 for Republicans, Democrats 202-737-0002, Independents 202-628-0205. We would especially like to hear from parents and educators because this is the topic that you are most responsible for. So give us a call if you've got some kids in school or if you're in charge of trying to educate the kids from 8 o'clock in the morning till about 4 in the afternoon. Our first call comes from Miami, Florida, on our line for Republicans. Go ahead.
The United States Supreme Court in a Zellman case in Cleveland, Ohio, said that school vouchers are totally constitutional as long as they're given to the parent and not to a religious institution. We refer to the schools our children go to with a Latin term, alma mater, which in English means other mother. Why would we let the government choose our children's other mother? You know, we want to have freedom of choice on abortion. We don't want to have freedom of choice on our children's education. I have another part to this, but I'd like you to address that first, if you would.
Mark Egan, why don't you go ahead and take the first part?
Well, the caller is correct about the Supreme Court decision. That was a couple of years ago, and they did say that vouchers in the Cleveland school district were okay. The theory at that point was that we were going to see a proliferation of voucher programs around the country after that. It hasn't happened. We think it hasn't happened for a lot of reasons, chiefly that there are a number of policy problems with school vouchers, draining resources from public schools, no public accountability with private education. They're not accountable to taxpayers. They're accountable to the parents of their students. The achievement results have been rather dismal in the private voucher programs around the country. You know, this is not about parental choice in terms of sending their children to whatever school they want to. They have that right. If they want to send their child to a private school, they have that right. If they want to homeschool their child, they have that right in this country. We're talking about public money that is spent on education. And in the view of the National School Boards Association, public money should be invested in the public schools that are open to all students, that are publicly accountable for achievement, for the quality of their teachers, for the standards and the curriculum that they teach their students.
Caller, are you still there?
Yes, sir.
And part two of your question.
Yes. When Mr. Egan says that when the Supreme Court approved vouchers, they expected a proliferation of voucher schools, which did not happen. Mr. Egan knows that that did not happen because 37 states in the United States have what are called Blaine amendments, which the United States Supreme Court, when they approved school vouchers, said are rooted in anti-Catholic bigotry and called for their removal. Now, I don't think any religious person thinks they have the right to impose their religious views on a public school. But my question is, does a public school have a right to impose its views on our children, views which contradict our religious beliefs?
We're going to leave it there quickly.
Again, every parent has a right to send their child to a private school or religious school if they want. They do not have a right, in our view, of using public money to pay for that tuition. And, you know, I would argue with the caller that it's not about constitutional prohibition in different states that's prevented vouchers from being created in other states. It's a lot of reasons, a lot of policy arguments. And, you know, voters around the country have rejected this idea a number of times. They've weighed the pros and the cons. It's not just about what the Constitution does or does not say.
Jeanne Allen, I know you want to weigh in.
There are reasonable points of opposition, and Mark is making some of them, but we have to remember that every day, right here in Washington with the Capitol behind us, we are asking our representatives to help us support people who are more in need. We're asking them for health care support. We're asking them for support for housing vouchers. We provide support to people who cannot make ends meet or cannot do it themselves every day. That's one of the roles of the federal national government. When it comes to education, we should do no less. We've done it for higher ed, we've done it for pre-K, and all the president and other people for years from both parties, from Senator Daniel Moynihan to others in between, have said is that we need to ensure that if a child is in a failing school, they don't have to be there for more than one day. If there's a great school right next door that they could attend, regardless of whether they have money or not, and that just makes sense.
Alameda, California, thank you for waiting.
Good morning. Well, I just heard the term again, failing schools. I must confess, I want to throw bricks at the TV sometimes when I hear that. Until we also talk about failing parents and failing students, we can throw money at schools and we're not going to see a lot of improvement Schools are not 100% responsible. Students do not come into schools like clay, where teachers and administration can mold these students into whatever we want. Unless we talk about how we are going to help parents help their children and actually get students to do what's required of them, we're going to throw money and throw money and throw money, and we're not going to see improvement.
Thanks for your call. Jeanne Allen, go ahead.
Well, there are failing schools, and we just have to recognize that. And I'm sorry it makes you upset. It makes me really mad every day, in fact. And the reason there are failing schools have to do with a lot of issues, and you're absolutely right. But the reality is, without giving parents an option to actually make fundamental decisions about their kids, we've removed parents from the equation, and choices in the most inner cities have given those parents and those children of those parents an opportunity to get engaged in a way that they never have before. Second point I would make is, next to the family, there is empirical research that shows that a teacher is the single most important factor in a child's life during their educational years, barring a family. And we have seen schools all over the country who have very little means, who have taken a child and helped mold them into good readers, good listeners, and actually productive citizens, because we've actually put the tools in place. It's not one answer, but there are failing schools, and we have to do everything we can to change that. And it's not just about a conversation around society. It starts now, and we've seen it can work.
Washington, D.C., go ahead.
Mr. Egan, you are not being truthful this morning about vouchers at all, and I really wish there was someone that would represent your side that would give honest information. Number one, studies are clear that students who have been enrolled in voucher programs for 3 years or more far surpass traditional public school students in academics. And you could do a Google search and in 2 minutes come up with that research, I'm sure. Secondly, no voucher program in the country has taken money from the traditional public school system. Politically, in order to get these programs approved, in every case, public schools has ended up with more money than before a voucher program was approved. Number three, I don't like the way that you're downplaying the fact that vouchers are accountable to the parents who send their kids there, instead of, the way public schools are, because what vouchers obtain are finally making parents the customer in the public school system. I am the chairman of the board of a charter school in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has about 55 charter schools. They are over-enrolled. They have now 30% of all public school students, and I think what Mr. Egan is afraid of is exactly what's happening in the D.C. public charter school movement, in that as soon as these schools open, parents rush to them and try and get their kids enrolled in them. And I think he's concerned about the competition to traditional public schools, that parents in D.C. want to leave as quickly as they possibly can, because we are spending more in D.C. than anywhere in the country to educate these children in the traditional public school system, and we are getting the worst standardized test scores of anywhere in the country.
Mr. Egan.
Well, a lot to chew on there. Let's just take it one by one. The academic results, the achievement. The fact of the matter is there have been a lot of studies on voucher programs all around this country. Publicly funded voucher programs, privately funded voucher programs. The most credible studies, and that's not the National School Board's talking, that's not voucher opponents talking. The most credible studies that have been looked at by a host of researchers, that have been looked at by impartial sources like the Government Accountability Office, they have found that the best studies showed no differences overall academically between voucher students and public school students. Those were the official evaluations out of the Milwaukee program and the official evaluation out of the Cleveland program. There have been other studies conducted by individuals. Perhaps you could call them researchers. They've been funded by the voucher movement. They are not impartial sources. They've released studies that show huge gains for voucher students, and then when other researchers get their hands on the data, that case starts to crumble. Case in point, New York City has long had a privately funded voucher program. Back before a couple presidential election campaigns ago, big fanfare about a research report that showed African American students in this program had made huge achievement gains. And it got a lot of play, was intended, I think, probably to influence the presidential election. This was back, I think, in 2000. When other researchers looked at the data, they found that, lo and behold, a lot of the students in that program, their scores hadn't been counted. They had been excluded from the sample. And when you actually counted the students in that sample, the achievement gains disappeared. So it's not a matter of, is there research out there? It's how credible is the research? And again, impartial sources have said the best research has shown no differences academically. Second point about taking money from the public schools. Cleveland, that program, the voucher program, the money for vouchers comes out of a pot of money from Cleveland Public Schools called Disadvantaged Pupil Impact Aid. It's supposed to pay for smaller class sizes, for reading improvement programs for poor kids, all-day kindergarten, strategies that we know have worked around the country in improving student achievement. The money comes out of that pot of money for Cleveland Public Schools and goes to pay for vouchers, in many cases for students who already attended private schools. Now, we don't think that's a sound strategy for helping the poor children and the public school students in Cleveland to improve achievement. Second, or the last point on accountability. I think we have a fundamental disagreement, probably Jeanne and I, on accountability. When we're talking about public accountability in public education, public accountability for public dollars, we've got to keep in mind that it's the taxpayers' money. It doesn't belong to any one parent. And private schools are accountable to their customer base, which are their parents. They're not accountable to the public at large. They don't have to make their standards public, their achievement results public, their budgets are not public. They don't have public board meetings like school boards around the country. So there's a difference between individual accountability and public accountability, and we're talking about tax money. And just very quickly, the last point about competition. Public schools are not at all afraid of competition, but we have not seen a single voucher program around the country where the private schools play by the same rules as the public schools. I'm talking about accepting every student who wants to go to that private school, not limiting the number of seats that are available, making your achievement results public, giving students similar tests that the students in public schools are taking so that we can have a fair comparison.
Our next call comes from Des Moines, Iowa, on our line for Democrats. Des Moines?
Yeah, this is Des Moines.
Weigh in.
Okay, my first comment is I feel the voucher program is taking us back to separate and equal. I visited a school in Milwaukee 2 years ago, and it was a charter school, and it was 100% African American. I didn't think I'd see a school like that in this day and age. So I think Milwaukee did some things where they stopped busing and said kids will go to their neighborhood schools, and that's what happened. But when we name schools failing, take kids out, say parents can control, where those kids go, and they'll go to better schools, you are taking money away from kids with voiceless parents, parents who don't have the education, parents who can't speak up for their own children, and we have plenty of those parents. So we have to educate parents, we have to educate children, and taking money away with vouchers from public schools is the problem.
Thanks for your call. Jeanne Allen.
This notion about taking money away, siphoning it off from public schools is probably the most misunderstood and the most ill-conceived. And here's why. Money that's allocated from states and local communities is for every child. And even though we actually do fund education in sort of strange formula ways, and we throw gobs of money at Cleveland Public Schools year after year without educational improvements, which is why we had that program to begin with, because if things have been going well, people wouldn't make such radical change. But even though you're sending that money, it didn't have an impact. So what they've done through the notion of vouchers and even charter schools is they've said, let's split up the pie and say per child, we know we're spending, let's say, $7,000 or $8,000. In DC, it's about 12. We're going to take that money and we're going to put it, basically strap it to the backs of every child so every child is worth the same amount. I can't think of a better way to give parents who don't have a voice, because it's actually the parents who don't have the recognition and aren't involved in the day-to-day world and civic groups that use it first. Every single piece of evidence we have. We study the nation's charter schools, we study the school choice programs. It is overwhelmingly minority, disproportionately disadvantaged children in those schools. And in terms of that school you saw, there may have been 100% black kids going there because it's a choice parents made, but actually on average, charter schools are more integrated. Private schools in inner cities are more integrated than our best efforts at forcing kids together have been, which is one of the reasons why you have everyone from Barack Obama to George Bush supporting something like charter schools. And I think it's really important that while I'm so appreciative of your concern, and we have to always be thinking about what's the next step in educating parents, money belongs to our kids, and no child should be branded by zip code. And what we have to do is think about it. If we're doing the best job, people are not going to leave. And if we're doing a bad job, no matter where and how and whose fault, we have to do something while we pick through why the adults are not doing everything they can.
We're talking about Pell Grants for K through 12 and other voucher programs. The President, in his last State of the Union address, proposed offering Pell Grants to students in kindergarten through high school. And with us is Jeanne Allen, who is the President for the Center for Education Reform. And if you want to find out more about her particular organization, you can go to her website, or the organization's website, which is www.edreform.com. And she is an advisor to numerous national and community-based organizations, including the National Governors Association, and creator of Chalk Talk and blogs on educational choice issues. We're also talking with Mark Egan, who is the Voucher Strategy Center Director for the National School Boards Association. And their website is hyperlinked and also can be found at www.nsba.org. And previously, he was a lobbyist and communication specialist at the Alabama Association of School Boards from 1996 to the year 2000. Back to the phones. Allison, Michigan, on our line for Republicans. Go ahead.
Hi there. Am I on?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I'm sorry, I have a cold, so you have to kind of bear with me. I've worked in a charter school system, and it's true, some of the charter schools really, don't come up to aren't really any difference in some of the failing public schools, but I still think that, the Department of Education trying to run this monopoly on supposedly educating the vast, majority of students, it's obvious that these collective pool of people cannot run this department any better than the government runs anything else. So I'm telling you, that public money is exactly that. It's my money. It's my taxes. And I don't like pushing all this money into a big pot and letting people, dip their hand in there and do whatever they want with it, whatever they deem is necessary and right to fund their school. But then my choice is, left in the wind. Why should people who want to send their kids to private school, I don't care if it's Catholic school or whatever it is, that's their choice. Let them take their money. Let them, when they pay their income tax, write off a thing at the bottom that says, I am sending my child to a specific school. I want to bow out of having to fund for, the public school program at this time. They could change their mind next year if they wish. But having to pay for both is unfair to me, the public, and it's stopping the parent from being able to make a selective choice per their child, number one. Number two, the whole idea that, tax money is public and we can't say anything about it, is that whole thing right there, that whole concept is got to stop. I mean, that's like the national herd. We're being pulled by the ring in our nose. We have a voice, and we should do that when we vote. And I just think that more parents need to go into the public schools and into the charter schools, get involved, like that other lady said. It's not just up to the public schools to fix this, quagmire that we're in, but we need to do something about it as a taxpayer. We have a voice, and you've got to do something about it if you want to make a change. Thanks
for your call, ma'am. Mark Egan.
Again, a lot of points to chew on here. The caller is correct talking about parental involvement. Jeanne mentioned it earlier, and we've seen different school systems around the country where they have had some struggling schools. I'm thinking about the Miami School District in particular. They've instituted parent academies. They've made a lot of changes in some of their lowest performing schools, and they've seen very impressive gains across the board for student achievement, involving parents, helping parents to become more involved in their children's education, giving them some of the skills and tools that they need to help. We wholeheartedly support that. The issue of double taxation that the caller referenced, that if you pay for private education, you're also still paying taxes for public schools. You know, look at it, I think, from what we pay taxes for across the board. Police and fire protection. Well, a lot of people have home security systems. They don't get a voucher to offset the cost of purchasing a home security system because they still rely on the police department for different things. We pay for public parks with our tax money. If you join a country club, you don't get a voucher or a tax credit for doing that. Public education is a public good, and you know, because we have 90% of all of our students going to these schools, we need to make sure that those schools are doing the best job they can. And in terms of taxpayers should have a right to say, you know, how is our tax money being spent? What are we getting for that? We couldn't agree more. And in fact, I think that's one of the arguments against vouchers, because it is money that belongs to all taxpayers, and yet private voucher schools are not accountable to all taxpayers. So, you know, taxpayers in Florida, in Milwaukee, around the country where they have voucher programs, if they want to find out what is the private school spending my tax dollars on, what are the students learning, are the students learning, they can't get an answer to that question. The public schools, we know they're not perfect. They're a continual work in progress like any entity. They will continue to be working to get better, but they are open to the public. They are publicly accountable. And if you don't like what's happening in your local school, you can go to the school board and you can demand change. You can run for the school board, which we see happen a lot of times, to try to get on the school board and make change that way. They are a public entity. They belong to the community that they represent and that they serve. And we think that's really where a huge difference between public schools and private schools.
Nashville, Tennessee.
Good morning. I'm a first-time caller. I'm also a very involved parent. I have a child both in an academic public magnet high school as well as in a private school. So I'm going to try to make some points very quickly. Yes, parental involvement is very critical. However, we also need incredibly strong leadership in every school building, and we need exceptional teachers in every classroom. Somebody made the comment that the federal government has very little to do with education. Well, while the federal government may provide 10% of the funding, NCLB is the biggest noose around the school's neck, so the federal government drives everything happening in the schools right now. Somebody said all children are entitled to an education, and education is not entitled in the Constitution, so it is not guaranteed. I firmly believe that the money needs to follow the child, so thank you for saying that. Also believe education needs to be local, and you all, we need to improve the caliber of our teachers coming out of our ed schools because the curriculum there, frankly, is incredibly weak. The problems start in third grade. We do not have qualified teachers teaching math or teaching reading, and it goes from there. So whatever we need to do to improve education, I'm all for it, but I believe we need site-based management, and I believe education is local, and the principals need that ability to do what is needed for their students, including their curriculum and whatever else it takes. But we need top-quality leaders, and we need educators educated to teach.
Nashville, before I let you go, tell me the age difference between your two children and why you choose to send one to a public school and one to a private school.
Actually, they're 23 months apart. I have a sophomore in the public school and a senior in the private school, and the reason he is in private school, and the sole reason, is because my neighborhood middle school, which is less than 2 miles down the street, failed him. We went there from its first 3 years of opening, and by the time he was in 7th grade, I knew he was ill-prepared for high school, so I had no choice but to put him in a private school. So thank you for asking.
Jeanne Allen.
I need to tell the caller, first of all, thank you for being so informed and so active. Second of all, Rob, we hear from hundreds of people like that every week at our organization, Center for Education Reform, literally, and that's not just a shameless plug. We hear from people like that who've had to make decisions, who are not sure, who don't have options oftentimes, like the caller does, and who are trying to get informed, and they are at all income levels and all stages. So I just want to say that because I think that's something that people sitting in Washington all the time tend to overlook. They haven't had an opportunity to engage their school board. Sometimes their school board, I just want to say, is overly political. It's their next step to Congress, whether we like it or not. It's not the bastion of great policy ideas that it once was when even I was growing up and my parents and their friends were on it and trying to make that difference. It's just become very, very political. But here's what I want to say about accountability, because it keeps coming up. We have accountability really mixed up. Accountability is not, oh, there's a school board member who was elected with 10% of the vote, and they make decisions, and therefore, because I can vote for them, the schools are more accountable. We have a real big accountability problem in this country, which is why we've had so many different changes at the federal, state, and local level to try to get a noose around it. Unfortunately, in some cases, that's what's had to happen, you know. But the reality is that there's no better accountability than setting standards, measuring where kids are, letting parents be part of the equation, as well as allowing states to be able to publish and demonstrate where it is our schools are on a regular basis. But we just have to knock this out of the park. Accountability is both being able to demonstrate success, having parents and the general public evaluate success, but it doesn't mean school boards. That's just one level, and it's not everything.
Next up is Thomasville, Georgia, on our line for Democrats.
Good morning. I am totally against vouchers. I have worked in a public school system. I see children do extremely well under a teacher. I see students do extremely poorly under the same teacher, an excellent teacher. If we do not involve or have involvement from parents, then children are lost. No Child Left Behind has been the worst thing this country could have. These teachers are spending so much time teaching to test. They are teaching children to pass a test.
Okay, we don't want to get bogged down too much in No Child Left Behind. That's a whole nother show. Tell me, before I let you go, what is it that you were doing in the school system?
I worked in a media center with reading and seeing 7th and 8th grade students reading on a 2nd and 3rd grade level because they've been passed.
And do you think that these kids would have benefited from some kind of a voucher program?
I do not. I think they would have benefited from having written literature materials in their home, having parents involved. I keep hearing, someone say that parents are involved. They have the opportunity in public schools to be involved if they choose.
Thanks for your call. Jeanne?
One of the things that private schools and charter schools do more effectively right now, and they're teaching an awful lot of public schools to do this, traditional public schools, because charters are public. And let me just also add, there are effective public schools, there are effective charter schools, there are effective private schools, and there are ways to figure that out, and NCLB has lots of issues, but one of the things we've been able to see for the first time is the reason we have data that we can even talk about, the reason teachers even know that there's a standard is because NCLB helped infuse a lot of that. But when you walk into a private school or a charter school in most cities in this country, people are there earlier. They're not hamstrung by union contracts that require them to not show up at a certain time or to be limited away from the lunchroom where maybe there's more boisterous kids. They're not required to leave at 3:30 because the union steward said they're not supposed to stay after school because they're not getting paid for it. You see lots of flexibility with teacher programs, with curriculum, with standards, and an attempt to actually really infuse education in the community to help make up for where there are parents missing. But even in those places where the worst off parent is perceived as not being involved, those schools make a compact with those parents and they become more involved, which is why they're oversubscribed.
Mark Egan.
Well, several callers now have talked about the importance of teachers, and actually this is a place where Jeanne and I might actually agree. Teachers clearly are the most important, and the research is very clear on this, the most important in-school factor in raising student achievement. So if we want to make the best investment we can make in education and in raising student achievement, which has to be the top goal, is to invest in our teachers. We need to pay them better. We need to give them more support, more professional development. A lot of the presidential candidates are talking about rewarding teachers if they teach in hard-to-staff schools. I mentioned Miami earlier and some of the gains that they're making. They're doing that. Some of the teachers that they have put in their schools that were struggling the most, they are paid higher salaries, and they're getting results. So we need to look at that. I can't let sit there, though, something Jeanne was saying earlier about school boards. And having worked with school board members now for a number of years, I can tell you that around the country, you have 95,000 school board members around the country. Overwhelmingly, these are volunteers, all ages, all races. They come from all levels of politics, Republicans, Democrats, different businesses, business leaders. They are dedicated to improving the education of the children in their community. They're not there for a higher glory. Some will go for higher office, but the vast, vast majority are there to volunteer, give countless hours, talk with people like Jeanne, go on programs like this, talk about what is happening in their schools, what's not working, what they need. And school boards, yes, are only one level of accountability. There are multiple levels. And I find it kind of funny that Jeanne's talking about all this data that's available from public schools, which is very true. Unfortunately, when it comes to private voucher schools, there's almost no data available. We talk about competition. We're all for that. Let's have our data and your data side by side, and we'll take a look at it. The reality, again, where there has been research done, Jeanne was talking about Cleveland and some of the problems in the public schools, and that's why students have taken vouchers to go to private schools. The research shows the students in the private schools in Cleveland have been outperformed by the students in Cleveland public schools. And a lot of those kids already were in private schools, so they weren't leaving public schools to begin with. They were already in private schools. So again, data is very important, and I think as this debate has moved forward over the last many years, there's been more data coming out, and it has not been very favorable for vouchers, which I think is why the president's plan is DOA on Capitol Hill.
The conversation is about Pell Grants for kids in K-12. It's a proposal put forward by the president in his last State of the Union address for a $300 million proposal that would permit students to use grants for private or parochial schools. Back to the phones, Dumfries, Virginia, on our line for Republicans. Thanks for waiting.
Good morning. I hope you allow me to make my point. I've been holding on for quite some time. The first thing is I absolutely 100% concur with the Tennessee caller. She hit everything on the head. As far as the public school system, I am so tired of being treated like I am not an individual, like my children aren't individuals. And this gentleman sits there and says things like the African American students test rose, and as if African American students or white students or Asian students or whomever are not individuals. If there's a certain percentage of test scores that has risen, why don't you just say that instead of lumping races of people together as if we're not individuals? I am taking my children out of public school, and they will be going to private school next year, and it's because they are not challenged. Their teachers are basically, I can't even describe the silliness of some of the teachers. They're just not up to par. And the elitism of the office workers, and even this gentleman sitting here, just an elitist. And that's the way a lot of the public school around the country. We're military, so I've traveled around. They act like a bunch of elitists. Whereas some of the public schools that I go to, that where I've been visiting because my children will be going there, they treat me as a person. Just a moment, sweetie. They treat me as a person who knows about children, because I have children.
Okay, ma'am. Can you tell me how much is it going to cost you to take your kids out of public schools and put them in private schools, and will you be looking for any kind of financial aid in order to do that?
Well, as far as the cost, I believe it's, I'm not exactly sure of the cost, but I know that we can't afford it and I won't be getting any assistance. However, it's just a better thing for my children. They're not being challenged. I have children who are, I don't know if because I homeschool in the summertime and they're just ahead when they go back to school. However, it's gotten to the point where they're just not being challenged and they're not learning at the rate that I feel that they should be learning. And
thanks, ma'am. We're going to leave it. Hold on a second. Mark?
Well, I can't speak for the caller's personal situation or her school. I'll take her at her word, and I think it's unfortunate that any parent feels that way about the education that their child is getting or is not getting. Again, I go back to what we know from schools around this country, and I think most teachers, almost all teachers, I think, they do their very best in that classroom every single day. We need to give them as much support as they can receive, so that they can do the best job possible with every student. And I think there is a lot of a movement now, I think, about individual instruction and realizing that all children do not learn the same. And there's research on brain development in young children and how different students learn at different levels, at different paces. And we do need to look at individualized instruction. And public schools around the country are doing that, in fact. So again, I think any individual has the right to send their child to a private school if they wish. Again, in our view, public money should be invested in the public schools that are open to all students. We need to make sure that those schools have the resources that they need, and we need to set high standards. And you've seen that around the country with a lot of schools, very high standards for all students that we're trying to reach. And unfortunately, issues like vouchers and taking away resources and a distraction keeps us from reaching that goal as quickly as I think we would be able to. It takes us further from the goal of providing an excellent education for every student.
Jeanne Allen.
We've mentioned standards. We've talked about teachers and how a lot of people are actually now open to performance pay. I've been in this for a long time, and that's a new thing. The only reason I want to mention one thing about policy and then come back to the caller. There was a time in this country where we didn't even have the issue of standards and testing on the table. The whole notion of evaluating teachers to make sure they really are the best. I mean, dedication and commitment are one thing. All of us wake up in the morning wanting to do our best, but whether or not we succeed is another. And being able to measure children, measure and test whether students are doing well, whether our schools are the best, and whether we can do something about it are issues that were not on the table until school choice programs like charters and voucher schools were introduced into this country. And that's a fact. You want to talk about competition. The issue of having a parent take their money that's allocated for their child's education, a portion of it, because as one of the callers said earlier, these options are saving people money. Charter schools and voucher programs are oftentimes 60%, 70% or less of what's being spent in the public eye. Being able to have that money and move and vote with your feet is a very powerful thing, and it's what has transformed the policy debate where we can even have a discussion and look at standards and actually say that we've made some progress. The caller is absolutely right to be concerned and to do the right thing. We should be reaching out and helping people like that. I would just say one other thing. When Mark talks about school boards liking competition, we've been in 2 states in the last week where school boards have actually opposed efforts to create healthy charter school laws because they don't want anybody else approving those. And so at the national level, you might believe that, but the reality is school boards across the country are suing states to even give that modicum of public school choice, and we just think that's really unfortunate.
Can I respond to that?
Hold on a second. Before we go back to the phones, either one of you have any experience in the classroom?
No.
I do not.
Okay.
Other than having been a student. Can I respond to Jeannie's point about charter schools real quick?
Quickly.
The National School Boards Association has this idea that in Washington is sometimes looked at curiously as among Washington think tanks and politicians. We actually believe local communities know their local schools best. People in Washington don't know what's going on in local schools all around this country. So the idea of charter schools, public school boards are accountable for what happens in all their schools, whether they are traditional public schools or whether they are charter schools. So, I don't know what states you're talking about or what school boards you're talking about.
Georgia, Wyoming, Florida.
I'm sure they weighed the pros and cons of that application, and they decided that it wasn't in the best interest of their community schools. Again, the public can disagree, but it's in our view, it should not be people in Washington telling local communities all around the country that you should open up certain schools and that the school has to look like this. We ought to let it be determined by local individuals who are going to hear, if there are complaints about it, they're going to hear it at the grocery store every day.
Milwaukee, Wisconsin, jump in.
Yes, good morning. I want to interject something, if I could, very quickly. Well, actually, I have a question first, and it sounds like I haven't been paying attention, but with the Pell grants, are they used for children in grammar school and high school, or is it just college?
Right now, I believe it's just college.
Right.
Correct.
Okay. The
Pell Grant program is a college program, long-running college program. The proposal is for K through 12.
The proposal is to give grants to states or communities that actually want to give scholarships to kids, and then they can use it for anywhere they want with lower elementary and secondary schools.
Okay, that clears that up for me. I consider myself CIA, which is Catholic, Irish, and Alcoholic. I went to a Catholic grammar school, and that was back in 1950s. Well, I was born in 56, so it was in the early 60s that I started out in first grade at a Catholic grammar school. And at that point in time, being affiliated with the Catholic Church, the parents were quite comfortable in turning their kids over to the particular school, the particular diocese. And in my own case, I finished 8th grade, graduated. My parents picked out a Jesuit high school for me to go to. I spent 3 weeks there and decided high school was not for me. But
Milwaukee, this sounds like a great story, but we're running out of time, so could you please get to the point?
Yeah. I've heard recently that there are school districts that are paying children for getting good grades. And I wanted to know what your experts think about paying students for grades, or should there be a type of a reward system where if you maintain, say, through high school, a B average, you're more likely or more likely to be eligible for a Pell Grant? And
thanks for your call.
You know, one of the people who recommended that is a good friend and a phenomenal reformer. His name is Joel Klein. He's the chancellor of New York City Public Schools, and he came in, he's a former Clinton administration lawyer, and he came into New York, and he was just outraged by the state of education there, and has done all sorts of neat things, from try to renegotiate teacher pay contracts and union contracts to opening up new charter schools to giving parents lots of options and closing failing schools. And he said, you know, maybe we should start paying. He's one of several. Mark might know others. And at first glance, I go, you know what, that's not really what school systems are about. And frankly, if we start off with really good schools and teach kids the value of education, I mean, let's remember that this is something that dates and predates us and goes back to our founding fathers, who recognized that being educated is in and of itself a noble thing.
Back to the phones. Providence, Rhode Island on our line for Democrats. Thanks for waiting.
Good morning. I'm a teacher assistant in public schools in Johnston, which is a nearby town. And one of the previous callers, I heard her say that the teachers were not qualified, and that is an absolutely ludicrous statement. They are more than qualified. They give 1,000% to most of these students, and what I see is students coming to school, this is kindergarten, not prepared. We hand out homework. The parents never go into their backpacks or check to see. I'll ask them, where is your homework? They have to come in. First thing they do is have to put their homework in a little box, and most of them, my parents threw it away. I didn't know we had it. That parents don't even go into their backpacks and check. But to say that the teachers are responsible when I see them give 1,000%, most of these children are minorities. If we see them falling back, they go to team, which consists of teachers, principals, psychologists, social workers. Most of the time, parents don't show up, or they don't even check on these young students to see what their homework is, if it's getting done. And what I hear is, my parents threw it away. My parents told me not to do it. But what infuriates me is to blame the teachers, who I see give 1,000% of their time.
Thanks for your call, ma'am. Mark Egan.
Well, again, parents are critical. Parental involvement is essential, and teachers matter. And I think more and more members of Congress are recognizing that last point, that teachers do make a huge difference in the classroom, and we need to provide them with as much assistance as possible. And if they are performing very well, we need to look at different ways to encourage them to go to schools that need the most assistance.
But if I'm a parent and my child is in a school and the situation is like this, and there's a voucher program that will help me get my kid out of this situation, why shouldn't I be allowed to take advantage of that?
I think it probably sounds extremely appealing to any parent who's not happy with the current school that they might be in. Again, I will go back to, let's look at what the research actually shows. And most of these programs where vouchers have been tried, the arguments have been, let's give parents and kids a chance at a better education, and the public schools are not getting it done. Let's give the private schools a chance. And yet the data shows that the public schools perform either on par or in some cases even better than the private schools that the students with vouchers go to. So if we're focusing on achievement, again, the voucher track record is not an impressive one.
Rob, I just have to jump in though, because Mark keeps talking about data, and that's absolutely not true. And the reality is that the mobility is down, the retention is up, particularly in lower income schools. Across the country, wherever you've seen school choice program, publicly funded, privately funded, reading and math scores are 2-3 points beyond where they need to be, and frankly, the kids in those places are safer. If they are bad schools, they can leave. We're not forcing people with taxpayer money to go to a school at which they don't belong, and data, there's lots of data that we have that contradicts that.
Okay, let's get this call from Johnson City, Tennessee.
Yes, my name is Franco Richard. I'm calling from Johnson City, Tennessee. Of course, you already know that. My comment is this, and I have to go back and agree with Mrs. Egan for this particular reason. I taught in both venues, public and private school, and of course, Mr. Allen, I'm not making any difference to you. Whatever. My point here is that
Ms. Allen, Mr. Egan.
Oh, I have them backwards. Okay.
Yeah.
I need to put my glasses on. My point here is that the point taken is that when you're talking about statistics, and we can skew statistics, and I'm not saying this is the case in public school, but you can dumb down a curriculum and have 80% of the students making 100 or whatever the case may be as far as a grade mandates, and then the school next door where they're taking calculus and Chem 1 in this 8th, 9th grade, and they're not quite doing as well as far as grades are concerned. Yet when you take a look at how much is being spent per student in the public school per capita, as opposed to what the charters or the private schools are spending per capita, if we're just going to go on those statistics, we're talking about more bang for your buck, and I hate that particular comparison, but you're going to get more bang for your buck in the private school sector. The issue here is giving my child a choice, giving the parent a choice to put their child into a more productive educational environment. And
okay, Johnson City, sorry to cut you off, but Mark Egan, go ahead.
Sure. The argument about more bang for the buck in private schools. The fact of the matter is public schools offer not just education, but they provide a range of services for children, often children in poverty, that they do not get or will not get in many cases in private schools. Hot meal. In a lot of cases, the only hot meal that a child gets every day is in the public school. Transportation to and from school. Most private schools do not provide that. They pay their teachers higher salaries, usually because the teachers are more qualified than in private schools. There's data on that. I hate to keep going back to data, but it's important to have objective information here and not just anecdotes. Special education services. A lot of private schools either do not have the ability to provide the services that children with disabilities need. It's very costly to educate children with disabilities, so you do see a higher spending in public schools on average than you do in private schools. But let me say this: there's been this conventional wisdom, I think, for a number of years that private schools, simply by being private, are superior to public schools. And there have now been 3 consecutive years where there's been a national study done by different researchers, different data sets, that have compared the achievement of public schools and private schools. And I'm not talking about vouchers right now, just public schools and private schools in general. And when you compare the students and you factor in their socioeconomic background, their demographics, when you compare them and make it an apples-to-apples comparisons, the public schools do very well in comparison to public schools. In one of the studies, a national study, public school students outperform private school students in math. So
I got to get this last call in. Longview, Texas.
Yes, I appreciate it. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for waiting.
I appreciate it. Matter of fact, I happen to be a candidate for Congress against Louis Gohmert here in East Texas. Hopefully get that in. But here's my view, and I said this 25 years ago. You go back 200 years, what was the major industry? It was agriculture, farming. But what has happened over the last 200 years? The marketplace has diversified, and yet we're still using programs that was based on over 200 years ago as far as educating our children. And, respectfully, these two people that you have on your show, as you said, not a single one of them has any experience in a classroom. They look like a couple of attorneys to me, just talking heads up there, supporting their particular view. But the reality is we're forgetting about the individual student. And I personally feel, and think about this, because this is a radical way to think, that you should have maybe a general education up to about maybe the 6th to the 8th grade, but after that you should look at the individual student and you should really teach to the student to where they can hopefully assimilate into the job market of the future.
Thanks for your call. Longview, Jeanne Allen.
Well, hopefully you don't have to be a political science major to be able to vote, and you don't have to be a woman to be able to talk about women's rights, and it's just the same way you don't have to be a teacher to actually know something about education. I would just simply say, you're right, we have to have markets, but we should absolutely require kids to go to school the way we are today, and we should help them get the best education possible. And lots of people can disagree about how to get there, but the bottom line is commitment and knowledge are critical to us helping our children.
Jeanne Allen of the Center for Education Reform and Mark Egan of the National School Boards